Whispers followed Abigail Sterling like dust devils on the Texas plains, branding her a woman with a dangerous past and no future. Oakhaven expected her to finally break. Instead, Cole Callahan rode into town, a rugged drifter carrying his own ghosts, ready to prove every judgmental soul dead wrong. The Texas sun in 1884 was a cruel and unforgiving judge, beating down on the town of Oakhaven with a relentless fury that seemed to mirror the disposition of its residents. Abigail Sterling knew the heat well, but she knew the cold stares of her neighbors even better. She knelt on the rough wooden planks of her modest boarding house porch, scrubbing away the red dirt that the morning wind had blown in. The lye soap stung her cracked hands, but the physical discomfort was a welcome distraction from the whispers. Across the dusty thoroughfare, Mrs. Martha Higgins stood outside the mercantile with a parasol resting on her shoulder, her head tipped toward Sarah Jenkins. Neither woman bothered to lower their voices as Abigail wrung out her brush. "It's a disgrace. That's what it is." Martha's voice carried over the rattle of a passing buckboard wagon. A woman like that, operating a business in a decent, God-fearing town. My Josiah says it's only a matter of time before she draws the wrong kind of crowd. You know what she was in Abilene, the widow of a train robber. Some say she pulled the trigger on that Pinkerton man herself. Abigail kept her eyes locked on the damp wood. The rumors were half-truths, twisted into local legends. Yes, she had been married to Frank Sterling. Yes, Frank had been a notorious outlaw who terrorized the Kansas Pacific Railway. But Abigail had never held a gun to a decent man, nor had she known the extent of Frank's brutal nighttime excursions until the law had come kicking down their door, leaving Frank dead on the floorboards and Abigail in cuffs. She had spent 2 years in a sweltering state penitentiary as an accomplice, a sentence handed down simply because she was the wife who had washed the blood out of his shirts. When she was finally released, she changed her name, moved 300 miles south to Oakhaven, and poured every cent of her meager inheritance into this dilapidated boarding house, praying for a quiet, invisible life. But in a small western town, secrets were a currency, and Abigail's had been spent the moment Mayor Josiah Cobb received a telegram from an old associate in Abilene. From that day on, she was branded the Widow Sterling, the woman with a past. They said no decent cowboy, no man of standing, would ever want a woman whose name was written in a penitentiary ledger. Abigail finished her scrubbing, wiped her brow with the back of her forearm, and stood up. She smoothed the front of her faded blue cotton dress and turned to head inside, her shoulders stiff. She didn't need their pity, and she certainly didn't need their approval. She just needed paying guests. The sound of slow, heavy hoofbeats made her pause. Riding down the center of Oakhaven's main street was a solitary figure on a massive blue roan stallion. The man sat tall and relaxed in the saddle, wearing a dust-caked duster coat and a flat-brimmed Stetson pulled low over his brow. He didn't look like the typical drunken cattle drovers who occasionally passed through, tearing up the saloon and harassing the local women. There was a quiet, dangerous stillness to him. He spurred his horse gently, guiding it directly toward the hitching post in front of Abigail's boarding house. Martha Higgins abruptly stopped her gossiping, her eyes widening as the stranger dismounted. He tied his horse, unstrapped a worn leather saddlebag, and stepped onto Abigail's freshly scrubbed porch. He was taller than she had initially thought, broad-shouldered and lean, with a jawline covered in a week's worth of dark stubble. When he tipped his hat back, Abigail was struck by the piercing intensity of his steel-gray eyes. They were eyes that had seen the worst of the world and had refused to blink. "Afternoon, Mum," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the dry air. "Sign out front says you have rooms, hoping that includes a hot bath and a decent meal." Abigail swallowed hard, instinctively taking a half step back. "I do. It's $2 a week, in advance. Meals are 50 cents extra. Bath water costs a quarter, and you haul it yourself." She expected him to balk at the price. Or perhaps, as many men did when they realized who she was, sneer and ask if the room came with extra company. Instead, he simply reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a heavy silver dollar, and pressed it into her hand, along with 3 crumpled greenbacks. "Name is Cole Callahan," he said, holding her gaze. "Abigail," she replied softly, her fingers curling tightly around the money. "Room 3, top of the stairs, on the right." As Cole walked past her into the house, bringing with him the scent of leather, tobacco, and rain, Abigail looked across the street. Martha Higgins was staring at her with her unabashed judgment. Abigail lifted her chin, turned her back on the gossips, and followed her new boarder inside. For the first 3 days, Cole Callahan was a ghost. He left early in the morning, riding out toward the canyon, and returned just as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing Oak Haven in shadows. He ate the meals Abigail prepared in complete silence, sitting alone at the corner table of the dining room. He didn't drink at the local saloon. He didn't gamble at the poker tables. And he never once looked at Abigail with the predatory leer she had grown so accustomed to from men. But she caught him watching her, when she was hanging the laundry on the line behind the house, fighting the relentless Texas wind. She would see his silhouette leaning against the porch rail, a hand-rolled cigarette clamped between his teeth. He watched the way she worked tirelessly, stubbornly, as if her sheer force of will could scrub away her history. On the 4th evening, the fragile piece of the boarding house was shattered. Abigail was in the kitchen, washing the dinner plates, when the heavy oak front door banged open, hitting the interior wall with a violent crack. Heavy, unsteady boots stomped into the hallway. Abby? Oh, sweet, sinful Abby. Abigail's blood ran cold. It was Billy Cobb, the mayor's nephew. Billy was a notorious drunk, a young man who used his uncle's political influence as a shield for his cruelty. He had made it his personal mission to torment Abigail, convinced that a woman with a criminal past had no right to refuse his advances. She dried her hands on her apron and stepped out into the hallway. Billy was swaying near the bottom of the stairs, holding a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey. His eyes were bloodshot, his face flushed with liquor and malice. "Mr. Cobb," Abigail said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "You need to leave. This is a private establishment, and you are not a guest." Billy laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Private, that's a good one. Ain't nothing private about you. Widow Sterling. Half of Abilene knows what you're good for. My uncle says it's time we run you out of Oak Haven for good. But I told him I ought to get a taste of the outlaw life first." He lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with a bruising grip. Abigail gasped, thrashing against him, trying to pry his thick fingers off her arm. "Let go of me. Billy, I swear to God, You'll what?" Billy sneered, pulling her flush against his chest, his breath reeking of cheap alcohol. "Shoot me in the back like your dead husband did to that guard." Suddenly, the heavy thud of boots sounded from the top of the stairs. Cole Callahan descended the wooden steps with a terrifying slowness. He didn't shout. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply walked down. His eyes locked onto Billy with a cold, predatory focus. "Let her go," Cole said softly. The quietness of his command made it infinitely more menacing than a scream. Billy blinked, squinting up at the tall stranger. He loosened his grip on Abigail just a fraction, puffing out his chest. "Mind your own business. Drifter, this ain't your fight. This woman is a known criminal. She's town trash." Before Billy could take another breath, Cole closed the distance between them, in one fluid, lightning-fast motion. Cole grabbed Billy by the lapels of his jacket, hoisted him off his boots, and slammed him backward into the front door. The glass in the small window pane rattled violently. Billy gasped for air, the bottle of rye dropping from his hand and shattering on the floorboards, pooling amber liquid around their boots. "I said," Cole murmured, leaning in so his face was inches from Billy's terrified eyes. "Let her go." Billy scrambled back the moment Cole released him, tripping over the threshold and tumbling onto the dusty porch. He scrambled to his feet, his face pale, pointing a trembling finger at Cole. "You're a dead man. You hear me? My uncle is the mayor. Sheriff Danvers will have you hanging from the hanging tree by morning." Billy turned and bolted into the night. The silence that followed was heavy. Abigail stood against the hallway wall, rubbing her bruised wrist, her chest heaving. She expected Cole to demand an explanation. She expected him to pack his bags and leave, wanting no part of the trouble she inevitably attracted. Instead, Cole calmly walked over to the broom closet, retrieved a mop, and began cleaning up the shattered glass and whiskey. "You don't have to do that," Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. Cole didn't look up. "Glass is sharp, Mum. Wouldn't want you cutting your boots. Mr. Callahan." Abigail swallowed her pride. "He was right. About my past. They're going to come for you now. Josiah Cobb runs this town, and Levi Danvers is in his pocket. If you defend me, they'll ruin you too. They say no decent man would want anything to do with a woman who has a penitentiary record." Cole finally stopped mopping. He rested his hands on the wooden handle and looked at her. The dim glow of the kerosene lamp cast long shadows across his rugged features. "Abigail," he said quietly, "I didn't come to Oakhaven by accident." Abigail froze. "What do you mean?" "I know exactly who you are," Cole said, stepping closer. "I know about Frank. I know about the Kansas Pacific Railway robbery. And I know about the 2 years you spent in that cell." Panic flared in Abigail's chest. Was he a bounty hunter, a Pinkerton agent looking for hidden stolen money? "Who are you?" she demanded, stepping back. 6 years ago, during the raid on the Denver-Rio line. Cole continued, his voice steady. Frank Sterling's gang held up a train. A young guard tried to be a hero. He pulled a gun on Frank. Frank was going to shoot the boy dead right there in the passenger car. But a woman stepped in front of the gun. She told Frank the law was already coming, that shooting a kid wasn't worth the rope. She wrestled the gun down, taking a backhand to the face from her own husband for her trouble. But she saved that boy's life. Abigail stared at him, the memories rushing back, the smoke, the screaming, the sharp sting of Frank's heavy ring cutting her cheek. "That young guard," Cole said softly, taking off his hat, "was my little brother. Thomas." Abigail's breath hitched. "Tommy wrote to me about it," Cole explained. "Told me a dark-haired angel, married to the devil, saved his life. When I heard Frank was killed, and you took the fall for his crimes, I tried to find you. By the time I tracked the records to Abilene, you had vanished. Took me 2 years to pick up your trail and find you here in Oakhaven. You came all this way to thank me?" Abigail asked, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean line down her dust-smudged cheek. "I came to repay a debt," Cole said, his grey eyes softening for the first time. "I came to make sure the woman who gave my brother his life wasn't destroyed by a town full of hypocrites. They say no cowboy would want a woman with your past. They're fools, Abigail, because your past is the only reason my family still has a future." The tender moment was violently interrupted by the sound of shouting outside. Torches flickered through the front window, casting jagged, dancing shadows across the hallway walls. "Callahan," a gruff voice boomed from the street. It was Sheriff Levi Danvers. "Step out of the boarding house with your hands where I can see 'em. You're under arrest for assaulting Billy Cobb." Abigail grabbed Cole's arm. "Don't go out there. Levi will shoot you in the street and claim you resisted. Please, Cole. There's a back door through the kitchen. You can take your horse and ride out." Cole looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her fearful gaze. He reached up, gently brushing the stray tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. "I spent my whole life running cattle across the plains, running from towns, running from roots," Cole said, a grim smile playing on his lips. "I ain't running tonight, and I ain't letting them run you out, either." He unbuttoned his duster, revealing the heavy Colt .45 strapped to his hip. He checked the cylinder with a deadly, practiced precision, snapping it back into place with a sharp click. "Stay here. Abigail," he ordered. Cole pushed open the shattered front door and stepped out onto the porch. The street was crowded. Mayor Josiah Cobb stood near the front, looking smug, flanked by his bruised nephew, Billy, and Sheriff Danvers, who had his hand resting dangerously close to his own holster. A dozen other townsfolk, including Martha Higgins, lingered in the background, eager for the spectacle. "You got a lot of nerve, stranger," Sheriff Danvers spat, stepping up to the edge of the porch. "Coming into our town, laying hands on decent folks just to protect a low-down criminal harlot. The only criminal I saw tonight was the drunk trying to force himself on a woman in her own home." Cole's voice rang out, loud and clear, echoing off the wooden storefronts. "And the only low-down folks I see are the ones standing out here with torches, judging a woman who has 10 times the honor of anyone in this street." Mayor Cobb stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "You insolent drifter, you don't know who she is. She's a thief, a liar." "I know exactly who she is." "Mayor." Cole fired back, stepping down onto the first step of the porch, deliberately putting himself between the mob and Abigail's front door. "She's Abigail Sterling, and as of tomorrow morning, she's going to be my wife." The collective gasp from the crowd was audible over the crackling torches. Abigail, standing hidden in the shadows of the doorway, felt her knees go weak. "Wife, if you want to run her out of town," Cole said, his hand hovering inches from the pearl grip of his Colt, his eyes locking onto Sheriff Danvers with a lethal promise. "You're going to have to go through her husband to do it. Now, who wants to draw first?" The silence on the street was so absolute that Abigail could hear the frantic flutter of a moth trapped in the glass chimney of the porch lantern. Sheriff Levi Danvers stood frozen, his fingers twitching above the worn leather of his holster. He was a man accustomed to bullying drunks and intimidating farmers. He was not prepared to draw against a man whose eyes held the cold, empty promise of a graveyard. Cole Callahan didn't flinch. He stood like an oak tree rooted in the Texas dirt, his thumb resting lightly on the hammer of his Colt. Mayor Josiah Cobb was the first to blink. He recognized the lethal geometry of the standoff. If Danvers drew, Danvers would die, and in the ensuing chaos, Cole might just put a bullet in the mayor's chest for good measure. Cobb reached out, his fleshy hand gripping the sheriff's forearm. "Stand down, Levi," Cobb hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "He ain't worth the gunpowder. Not tonight." Danvers exhaled a shaky breath, slowly pulling his hand away from his hip. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dirt just inches from Cole's boots. "You got lucky, Drifter, but you can't stay awake forever. And this town don't take kindly to outsiders making the rules." "Then it's a good thing I'm buying property," Cole replied evenly. The mob, deprived of its promised bloodletting, began to fracture and disperse. Billy Cobb shot one last venomous glare at the boarding house before scurrying away behind his uncle. Within minutes, the street was empty, save for the blue roan stallion tied to the post, nickering softly in the cool night air. Cole backed into the house, never turning his back on the street until the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. He threw the deadbolt, then turned to find Abigail leaning heavily against the hallway wall, her face ashen. "A husband," she whispered, the word tasting strange and foreign on her tongue. "Cole, you don't have to do this. You saved me tonight. Your debt to my past is paid. You can ride out tomorrow." Cole unbuckled his gun belt and draped it over the back of a wooden chair. "Abigail, if I ride out tomorrow, Josiah Cobb will have a mob back on this porch by sundown. In 1884 Texas, a woman without a man to vouch for her has no legal standing. But a married woman, a woman whose husband has a fast draw and a deed to the property, the law has to respect that. Even Cobb's corrupted law. You would marry me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "A woman the whole town calls a criminal. A woman you barely know." Cole stepped closer, the harshness leaving his face. "I know the woman who took a beating to save a stranger's life on a train in Colorado. I know the woman who scrubs her porch until her hands bleed just to make an honest living. That's the woman I'm marrying." 3 days later, they stood in the parlor of Reverend Elias Hopkins. Elias was an outlier in Oakhaven, an elderly circuit rider who cared more for scripture than local gossip. With a simple gold band Cole had purchased in Fort Worth months prior, they exchanged vows. There was no lace dress, no celebratory feast, and no congregation. But as Cole slid the ring onto Abigail's finger, his calloused thumb gently brushing her knuckle, she felt a strange, terrifying spark of hope. Returning to the boarding house as Mrs., Abigail Callahan did not magically cure the town's hostility. It only changed the nature of their warfare. Mayor Cobb, humiliated in front of his electorate, initiated a silent siege. The town simply cut them off. When Abigail walked to Ezra Boone's butcher shop, she found the door locked, though she could see Ezra hiding behind the counter. When she visited the mercantile, Martha Higgins stood at the door with a broom, declaring they were fresh out of everything. Their paying boarders, feeling the pressure from the mayor, packed their bags and left by the end of the week. The boarding house was entirely empty. "They're trying to starve us out," Abigail said one evening, staring into a near-empty pantry. "If we can't buy supplies, we can't eat. If we don't have boarders, we can't pay the property tax to the First National Bank when it comes due next month. Cobb knows exactly what he's doing." Cole was sitting at the kitchen table, meticulously cleaning his Winchester rifle. "Cobb's a politician. He fights with ledgers and whispers. But he forgets I grew up on the plains. The next morning, Cole rode out before dawn. He returned at midday with a massive buck draped across his saddle and a sack full of wild pecans and prairie turnips. For the next 3 weeks, they lived off the land. Cole hunted, and Abigail learned to bake bread using wild wheat and a sourdough starter she traded with a passing Navajo family for a pair of old boots. In the quiet isolation of the boycotted house, a genuine partnership began to bloom. The marriage of convenience softened into something deeper. In the evenings, sitting by the hearth, Cole told her about his brother Thomas, who had gone on to become a teacher in St. Bohocas. Louis, thanks to her bravery. Abigail, in turn, spoke of the nightmares of the penitentiary, the cold, the damp, the feeling of being entirely forgotten by the world. For the first time in her life, a man listened to her not to judge, and not to exploit, but simply to understand. One night, as a thunderstorm rattled the window panes, Cole reached across the small space between their armchairs and took her hand. He didn't say a word, but the heavy, reassuring warmth of his grip told her everything she needed to know. She wasn't alone anymore, but the peace of their isolation was an illusion. Josiah Cobb was losing patience, and a desperate man is a dangerous man. The reckoning came on a sweltering afternoon, carried into Oakhaven by a man Abigail wished she would never see again. Rufus Caldwell. She recognized him instantly through the parlor window, the same cold eyes, the same cruel presence. He had been Frank's right hand, the architect of the robbery that had destroyed her life. And now he was back, dressed in fine clothes that couldn't hide what he truly was. But Rufus didn't come for a drink. He went straight to the mayor. Cole watched from the porch, his expression darkening. Cobb called him in. He said, "This isn't about your past. It's about your land." Abigail frowned, confusion flickering into dread. "The railroad's coming," Cole continued. "Only path-through runs right here. If they push you out, Cobb sells it and makes a fortune." The truth hit like a blow. Everything the whispers, the attacks had been a setup. She wasn't just a target. She was in the way. "We should leave," Abigail urged, gripping his shirt. "He'll kill us." Cole didn't move. "I'm not running. Not from him. Not from this." The attack came at midnight. Glass exploded inward as gunfire tore through the house. Cole dragged Abigail down behind the table just as bullets shredded the wall. Darkness swallowed the room when he killed the lamp. Outside, voices shouted, "Burn it!" A flaming torch crashed through the window, fire racing across the rug. Cole fired back, dropping one man, but more kept coming. Wood splintered, bullets tearing through the walls like a storm. Then the kitchen door burst open. Rufus stepped in, shotgun raised, a twisted grin on his face. "Where's the money?" he sneered. Cole spun, but too late. The blast slammed into his shoulder, throwing him across the floor. His gun skidded away. Abigail's world narrowed to a single moment. Fear vanished. All that remained was rage. She dove across the floor, fingers closing around Cole's fallen rifle. Rufus turned, but he was too slow. She fired. The shot roared through the house. Rufus staggered, shock in his eyes, then collapsed lifeless into the dirt. Silence followed. Outside, the gunfire stopped. The townspeople had finally come, surrounding Cobb and his men. The fight was over. Abigail dropped the rifle and rushed to Cole, pressing against his wound, her hands shaking. "You're not leaving me," she whispered. Cole managed a weak smile. That was one hell of a shot. By morning, the truth spread faster than any rumor. Cobb's scheme unraveled. Arrests followed. The corruption that had poisoned Oakhaven was dragged into the light. The town changed after that. People who had once turned their backs now walked past the boarding house in silence, forced to confront what they had ignored. Abigail didn't need their apologies. She had already won. Weeks later, life began again. The house filled with new faces, workers, engineers, men building something instead of tearing it down. A year passed. On a warm evening, Abigail stood on the porch, watching the sky burn gold and violet. The air smelled of summer, of something new. Cole stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, thinking about everything he asked softly. Abigail smiled, leaning back into him. "No," she said. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about survival. She was thinking about the future. Abigail and Cole's story proves that a dark past doesn't define your future, especially when true love rides into town. If this Wild West tale of redemption and courage kept you on the edge of your seat, let us know what you thought in the comments. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video so we can keep bringing you more incredible stories.